Hello, welcome to the Walrus Talks Advancing Work, presented by TD Bank Group. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I'm the Executive Director of the Walrus, and I'm also your host for this evening. We're thrilled to be here back in person in Toronto at Artscape Daniels Launchpad, as well as streaming live online at thewalrus.ca. So a big hello to the close to 300 households we have registered who are tuning in online tonight. And we encourage you all to share the conversation on social media. It's one way that we can connect the two rooms. Those of you who are with us in person and those of you who are tuning in from home, just use the hashtag Walrus Talks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered within the bounds of Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And at the Walrus, we're honored to carry on a long tradition of storytelling. We encourage all of you to take a moment to reflect on the land that you're on, whether you're joining us here in person or online. So a bit about the Walrus. The Walrus started 19 years ago really as an optimistic project to foster conversations across Canada. We recognize that these conversations are complex and more necessary. For us, they take place in many different forms. We're best known for our award-winning journalism in print. Some of you have magazines. Want to hold it up? I think some of you have it there. Okay, excellent. We're also available online at thewalrus.ca. We spark conversations through our podcasts and also in public event series like this, The Walrus Talks. And no matter where the Walrus is or how people connect with us, we embrace our commitment to be independent, to share multiple perspectives, and to bring together a community of interesting and interested people, that's all of you, to discuss the issues that matter most to us as Canadians. So thank you for being a part of this evening. This work is powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. Thank you to TD Bank Group for making this event possible. I'd like to take a moment to highlight TD's ongoing work to support the Walrus in increasing accessibility in all that we do. We've been working with TD since 2019 on the TD Fellowship on Disability and Inclusion, and a shout out to our 2022 TD Fellow, Tricia Gregorio, there in the room tonight. I'd also like to welcome, to open the event right now, Janice Farrell Jones, Senior Vice President, Sustainability and Corporate Citizenship at TD Bank Group. Please welcome to the stage, Janice.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here tonight on behalf of TD Bank. My name is Janice Farrell Jones. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sustainability and Corporate Citizenship. And I'm particularly excited for tonight's event and the focus on advancing work, because it's an important topic to me and to my colleagues at TD. I'm really proud to lead a group at TD of passionate and inspiring professionals who are dedicated to helping to create a more connected, equitable, and inclusive future. This includes supporting opportunities that encourage financial and economic inclusion and ones that help advance meaningful work in Canada. We have over 100,000 colleagues across North America at the bank, and as one of the largest employers in Canada, TD is often cited as one of the country's best places to work. But with this scale comes the recognition that we have an important role in shaping the future of work. But it also means we have the opportunity to support community initiatives that help Canadians navigate the changing landscape of work. At this moment in history, we as a society are dealing with so much. The long tail of the global pandemic has amplified economic and social disparity. Nearly every day, we see the impacts of racism, discrimination, and acts of violence. And of course, there's heightened concerns around the impacts of climate change. Floods, droughts, wildfires, and other natural disasters have brought the climate crisis into sharp focus. All of these factors contribute to a widening gap, and for many, a less hopeful outlook about the future. It's clear we have a challenge before us, and as corporate citizens, stakeholders, and private and public institutions, we need to come together to work on the solutions. At TD, we're interested in being part of these solutions while helping strengthen our communities in the process. Our aim is to continue collaborating with stakeholders and terrific groups like the Walrus to catalyze opportunities that help reskill and upskill Canadians for a changing workforce. But how do we get there? How can we collectively support people and communities today to achieve a thriving tomorrow? These are some of the questions we'll unpack this evening and hear the thoughtful perspective of our 7 esteemed speakers. A big thank you to the Walrus, our speakers, and everyone here for helping to make this event a truly engaging discussion. Enjoy the event. Back over to you, Jennifer.
I'm still about the elbow bumps. They work well. Thank you, Janice. Tonight, we are talking work. We're rethinking work. The pandemic has really changed the way we work, the way we see work, the way we imagine work. Our speakers will share their insights and opportunities. They'll also showcase strategies and resources, all in supporting workers and ultimately strengthening our communities. For anyone new to the Walrus Talks, here's how it works. 7 speakers, 7 minutes each, 7 different perspectives. These talks are back-to-back and will be followed by a reception for those of you who are with us in person. And we encourage you to stick around where we can carry on the conversation with our talkers. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Max Brault, Vice President, People and Change, BDO Canada, LLP. Golnaz Golnaraghi, founder, Accelerate Her Future. Alexandra McCann, Executive Director on SIDE. Paul Taylor, Executive Director, Food Share Toronto. Amanda Aziz, Immigration and Refugee Lawyer, Migrant Workers Centre, BC. Samir Khan, Senior Research and Evaluation Associate, Future Skills Centre. And Agapi Gessesse, Executive Director, C Centre for Young Black Professionals. Thank you all for joining us.
Awesome. So my name is Max Brault, and I'm going to be talking to you about my community, about people with disabilities. But before I really get into this conversation, I want to talk about how a person with a disability gets themselves ready for work. Now, before we start this, I want everybody in this room and everybody who's listening to me in virtual world to think about when they left university or college, or when they left home for the first time and started to work. Think about way back then. Now, when it comes to people with disabilities, I've done this talk a few times, and I always refer to this as the 5 Olympic rings. Before we even can talk about employment, we got to talk about the first ring. And the first ring is housing. Now, remember when you first left your house, what did you do? You most likely went and lived with colleagues, friends, roommates, that you found from high school. But most likely, people with disabilities end up staying at home. So about 90% of people with disabilities, their first job, they're most likely working at home. And they need to stay at home, and I'll explain a little bit why. But those who are fortunate, that 10% who do go out there and find housing, run into some very big problems. As you can see, I'm in a wheelchair. I got a really bad back end. Most bathrooms in small housing and university housing doesn't allow people with wheelchairs to come in. The second ring is transportation. Now, look, I get it. We all want to have a great society. We all want people to use bikes, and we all want to walk to work. I get it. But, let's face the fact. We are the North for a reason, right? We have snow 8 months of the year. I know I'm being sarcastic. I come from Ottawa, folks, okay? There's a lot of snow there. And for people with disabilities, we need to really rely on reliable transportation. And that's a big key factor. So for a lot of people with disabilities, we can't afford a car. We can't afford to get a car that's been chopped up, designed for people with wheelchairs. So we got to rely on local transportation. So again, go back to first ring number one. Ring number one, affordable housing, accessible housing. Ring number two, you need to be accessible to transportation that works for you. Now let's talk about ring number three. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because towards the end, I'm going to tell you about something that I'm going to announce that's just relatively new for our country. It's about 24 hours old. This is going to be relatively new for just this speaking engagement. And it's about services. With people with disabilities, we need services. So remember when you were living on your own, you know, the biggest thing you were asking is, where's the local pizza shop? Well, for us guys, that's what it was. It's pizza. For some of the ladies, maybe it's where the wine was. I don't know. I'm not a lady. But I can tell you one thing, right? For people with disabilities, we have one additional factor with services. And I'll give you a personal problem with me. So I go out, I move out on my own. I have access to local transportation. I was able to afford to buy my car. But I ran into a problem. I can't use a washing machine. I can't stick my hands in the washing machine. And back then, by the way, I'm 52 years old. So when I left the houses, they still had the machines where they were top loaders. Remember those suckers? They weren't the front loaders where you can open it up, throw it in. I think somebody was listening to me when I was in my youth. Can somebody design one with a front door? Anyways, I had to rely on my father. My father would come in, he would take the bag, and he would leave. And that was my bag of laundry. So I had to make sure I had clothes for 2 weeks for what was going to happen that week and for whatever my father was going to take away. The other problem I had is grocery shopping. You know, can you just imagine me walking around while wheeling around in a grocery store trying to pick up groceries? I only can pick up whatever my left hand can hold on to. So my father would meet me at a grocery store once a week, and we would go grocery shopping, and then we would come back. But there's one additional thing for people with disabilities, and that is attendant care services. Anybody familiar with that? And what that is that it's somebody to help me do the basics. Help me wake up in the morning, help me dress, help me go do my bathrooming, help me do all the things that, you know, you can possibly do to live. In some cases, even help me eat. So helping me get my food ready, help me eat the food. Now, I was fortunate in my 20s, my disability wasn't that severe. I was still able to cook. Now, the ladies I was dating at the time would question that kind of cooking because I can only really do two things, shake and bake chicken and, well, spaghetti. Yeah, that was pretty much exciting coming to my place. The fourth thing is community. Community is really, really important. And I'll tell you why community is important. When you were growing up, community is where you learned who you were. It's where you found your love. It's where you found your hobbies. It's what defined you later on in life. And now we get to employment. And I want to say one thing about employment. Employment in Canada has been relatively the same for persons with disabilities. It's been federally funded for most degree, and to a certain degree, provincially funded. But we've been doing the same thing for 40 years with the same results. For the last 40 years, people with disabilities have been experiencing an unemployment rate of 34%. Think about that, 34%. That's pretty shocking. When the average unemployment rate across this country is anywhere between 4.6 and 7% for anybody who are not disabled. So two things have happened that are really big in this country. The first thing that happened was about 3.5 years ago, which was pretty much what we call the Accessibility Canada Act, which now defines the rights that people with disabilities now have in this country. Now you're sitting there going, well, yeah, we had the charter, but the charter just said we could not be discriminated against. Now with the ACA, it defines that people with disabilities need to be understood in the workplace. need to have work plans about how to help people with disabilities ensure that they're working in the workplace. And this is a big deal because as of December of this particular month, all government agencies need to make their plans public. And by doing so, we get to criticize the government agencies. 6 months from now, all federal jurisdicted corporations need to make their plans public. So I'm going to let you guys go on one last note, and that this just became big news. One of the federal leading parties has now made it as a mandate for their next convention something called the NDIP, the National Disability Insurance Plan. And what is that? Here is what it is. It is a plan to ensure that all people with disabilities have free access to attendant care services from coast to coast to coast. We are now starting to think about how we do not leave any persons with disability left behind. So I gotta let you go. My 7 minutes are up. My name is Max Brault. Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm Golnaz Golnaraghi, and I'd like to talk to you about an elephant in the room that we must address. We may not be ignoring this elephant intentionally, but it sits in the confines of our organizations and workplaces, and it's been there for a while, growing and taking up space. By not addressing it, we are sending a message of complicity, and all the while patting ourselves on the back and for making progress. This elephant that we have ignored for far too long is that our workplace programs are not working for all women. In fact, these programs are failing Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. The reality is that many companies have spent the last few years investing in DEI initiatives, in creating mentorship and sponsorship programs to accelerate the careers of racialized and Indigenous women. And what the data tells us is that we have a lot of work still ahead of us. We're making progress, but we have a long way to go. A Diversity Institute study right here in Toronto showed that white identifying women across major Canadian cities are advancing into senior leadership roles at a much faster rate than women of color. In Toronto, that ratio is 7-1. We could say this is progress. We could say that we're advancing gender equity, but in reality, it isn't. In Canada, women of color represent 17% of entry-level positions, yet when we look at senior roles, that number is 6%. And depending on the community, there's variances, and it can be quite lower than that as well. So what we're seeing, there's a lot of factors that contribute to the numbers that I talked about and the issues that I talk about, but I'd like to focus on two things specifically tonight: the under-mentoring, the under-sponsorship of racialized and Indigenous women, as well as the prevalence of white saviorism in these programs. So a Lean-In report stated that 60% of women of color have never had a strong interaction with senior leaders in their organization, which, if we think about it, results in many having mentors that may be at lower levels within workplaces with less influence and power. And of course, what happens is that contributes to a systemic sponsorship gap. And recently, Rosalind Chow, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, wrote that many leaders often think they're sponsoring racialized people when in fact they're just mentoring them. So the inability to differentiate between these two concepts can have really detrimental effects on careers. Mentorship tends to be passive and private. Sponsorship tends to be more active and public. So the investments that we think we're making can really never be realized because we're failing to sponsor women of color in the same way that we sponsor our white identifying colleagues. So I love research. As someone who has their research degree, Ritu Basin, who's based right here in Toronto, and her colleagues studied sponsorship behaviors in Canada, and they found that people of color and Indigenous people are more likely to receive advice from leaders that serve to help fix the way they're perceived in the workplace, while their white colleagues are receiving advocacy that ultimately really has an impact on promotions and advancements in the workplace. So the prevalence of white supremacy and saviorism stem from an entire way of seeing and thinking about women of color, people of color, that is stemmed in attempts to rescue, to save, to fix, to assimilate. And we need to understand how saviorism culture is at play within our workplaces and institutions. And despite what colonization may have us wanting to believe, women of color, racialized women, Indigenous women, we do not need to be saved or rescued, and we certainly don't need fixing. The troubling thing is that these problems have been around for quite some time, and they have been around for decades and impacted many of us, myself included. In fact, many of you in this room, some of you in this room may have had impact as well. This is what motivated me to create Accelerate Her Future, and we often, as entrepreneurs, as change makers, create solutions that we wish we had as well. So, how do we solve the problem of under-mentoring and under-sponsorship? First, how we design our programs in our workplaces really matter. Are we taking a by-us, for-us approach, or are we taking a for-them approach? For example, when you think about programs in your own current workplaces or organizations, who was at the core of their development? Who sat at decision-making tables? Who dictated, designed, and dominated the programming? If these programs are developed by a homogeneous group who lack the lived experience to inform needs and gaps, and ultimately designing the programs, then we will continuously fail to meet the needs of women and all women. As women, we're not a monolith, and one-size-fits-all approaches simply don't work. They don't go far enough. Second, when it comes to eliminating issues of saviorism, a mentor's belief, so a sponsor, a mentor, an individual's belief, their assumptions, biases, can impact how they mentor and sponsor. So when an individual is motivated to lean into empathy, to lean into curiosity, to do the inner work, to engage in anti-racism work. And this is a process. It's not a one workshop situation. It takes time. But when they're really vested, they tend to be more inclined towards intentional advocacy as well as sponsorship of people, of women of color specifically. Now, if you know me, you know that I like real talk as well as meaningful solutions. And so if we can't honestly acknowledge the reality of what we're talking about, then we will never be able to remedy the issues. And I'm also a strong believer in collective action. Solving these problems and addressing these issues, these elephants, is not on the shoulders of one group, one person, one manager, or even one company. It's on all of us to challenge the status quo, unlearn white supremacy, and demand better. And that includes internalized white supremacy by many of us racialized individuals as well. So I want to end with a stat, a McKinsey report that stated 77% of employees report that they believe they're allies in the workplace, but of those, only 10% engage in mentorship or allyship of women of color specifically. So this is a stat that every single person in this room, me, you, all of us, has the power to change. And by the same account, that means that our inaction has the power to compound this stat significantly. When you leave here tonight, I want you to ask yourself a question. Am I helping to hide the elephant in the room, or am I helping to expose it? Examine your own behaviors and assumptions, and ask yourself, are you upholding white saviorism, or are we challenging white supremacy? And if the answers to these questions make you feel uncomfortable, I invite you to be curious, to lean into empathy, and to ask yourself how you are feeding the elephant. Just imagine how many lives all of us in this room could change today for a better tomorrow if we each committed to helping expose the elephant. Maybe if we each found one opportunity before the end of the year to be an active sponsor to Black, Indigenous, racialized women in our workplaces, imagine the combined impact we can have if we actually acknowledge the elephant in the room rather than disregard it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm Alex McCann, the Executive Director of Onside, and I'm coming from Nova Scotia. When I think of the future, and I think when all of us think of the future, we think of good things. We think of bright possibilities, self-driving cars, life-saving technology, automation, interesting new jobs, perhaps as a bioprocess engineer or maybe in the field of renewable energy. But when I think of the future and the kinds of businesses and opportunities that are going to be created, I also think about my past. I think about my grandfather, who was both an electrical engineer and a medical doctor. He became an engineer first, that was his dream, but amazingly, he decided to become a medical doctor only after he learned that nobody would hire a Black engineer. With all of his training, he couldn't work as an engineer. But my grandfather was fortunate and smart enough to pivot. When he became a medical doctor at age 37 in order to serve the Black community, though it was difficult, he knew he could carve out a place for himself as a doctor. Most do not have this opportunity. But I think of him and I wonder what he would have created as an engineer. What he might have done if he could have been included in his chosen profession, if he had been allowed in. And today, I wonder how many people are being left out of the opportunities to engage in an innovative economy of the future. Ensuring a positive and inclusive answer to this question has been a focus of my career, and I'm privileged at Onside to lead our work, which is focused on fostering inclusive, innovation-driven entrepreneurship to enable prosperity in Nova Scotia and beyond. We concentrate on this kind of entrepreneurship not only for the tech-enabled solutions that are provided by these kinds of companies, think of COVID-19 vaccines or renewable energy solutions, but also because of the advanced skills, the resources, wealth generation opportunities, and talent that these kinds of businesses attract. Moreover, according to Enrico Morietti, the author of The Geography of New Jobs, for every one innovation-based job that's created, 5 additional small to medium-sized jobs are created. Focusing on innovation-based entrepreneurship will not solve every economic problem that's out there. But considering its importance in economic recovery and contribution to GDP growth, we believe that gaining access to the opportunities and activities associated with an innovative economy are essential. For example, having the opportunity to secure a well-paid university research job, receive business mentorship, financing for women-led startups, or access to places and spaces that support innovation, such as an accelerator like Volta or Artscape Daniels, facilitate the conditions leading to beneficial social and economic outcomes. However, through our work with the Brookfield Institute on our Nova Scotia Inclusive Innovation Monitor, we know that the benefits and opportunities associated with the innovative economy are not widely distributed, especially among rural and BIPOC communities. Although Nova Scotia has a vibrant innovation landscape with leading universities and research facilities, especially in ocean tech and life sciences, a Black male tech worker working in Nova Scotia makes roughly $13,400 less than the Canadian average. Women-led tech startups are starting to see increasing investment, but only really receive about 3% of all investments. If you're Black or Indigenous as an entrepreneur, you're even less likely to receive the financing you need to grow and scale your company. And we know that decisions around who receives investments have huge impacts on who is able to generate wealth and prosperity. Moreover, roughly half of our population in Nova Scotia live in rural areas and are still hindered by spotty internet, lags in technology adoption to support traditional industries such as agriculture and fisheries, and don't have the same access to innovation-based supports that can help accelerate growth in their regions. Creating a common reference point, our Inclusive Innovation Monitor, has been a tool that has helped decision makers and leaders understand where we are doing well in our ecosystem and where there is more to do. There is real power in knowing and understanding something at the same time as others, and with a sense of urgency and strategic intent that allows you to take action to impact a system for the better. With the intention of activating a more inclusive system, we recently ran a multi-stakeholder, community-focused pilot program in Nova Scotia to jumpstart innovation-based ecosystems. This evidence-based approach was from MIT Regional Entrepreneur Acceleration Program, and it brought cutting-edge insights and knowledge on ecosystem acceleration to our 5 rural teams across the province. These rural teams work to understand the nature of their innovation ecosystems, the stakeholders who have the influence and energy to activate change, and their local comparative advantage that, if amplified, could make a significant impact in supporting innovation-based entrepreneurship and mindsets in their community. The aim of this approach was to put communities in the driver's seat, so that they would be able to determine their own strategy and enable solutions that make sense in their own local context, not because someone else told them to do so. Innovative people, communities, and businesses build the future with every decision that they take. We're proud of all of our teams, but I'll highlight one, which is the Annapolis Valley team, who are currently working with regional leaders and entrepreneurs on an ag tech accelerator as the nexus of their regional innovation acceleration strategy. And this work aims to engage their entire ecosystem, positioning access and opportunity for a bright tomorrow. We are currently in the throes of great transformation, and equity and inclusion are worth fighting for. It's time for us to imagine what an innovation ecosystem actually looks like in the future. Who's showing up as the next tech workers? Who's deciding what problems are being solved? And how wealth is being distributed? I've shared an example of how we have mobilized our community for an inclusive and economic growth strategy, and I wonder how you will mobilize yours. Thank you.
Good evening. Here we go. How's everybody doing? Good. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I had one of those mornings, you know, when you have to give a talk and you stare at your computer screen as you're thinking about what you're going to share with folks, and I came up with not a lot. And then I just found myself, you see that advancing work in green on the screen there? The same thing was on my keyboard, and I found myself staring at my keyboard, looking at advancing work and really reflecting on it. And it really hit me, you know, as I sat reflecting on what I wanted to share. It reminded me of how far we've come from what was once, you know, a collective focus on living a good life. I don't want to advance work. I don't want to. You might. I don't want to. I want to advance life, a good life for all of us. We've stopped expecting to live a life where we have access to the things that we need. In fact, not just to survive, but to thrive. We should all be able to play, to dream, to have a dignified life, even with a bit of joy. In the absence of governments and politicians committed to advancing what we really need and deserve, we look to the benevolence of employers. The challenge is, they are the very folks who often stand to benefit the most from income inequality and many of the other ways that workers have been allowed to struggle. Perverse, if you ask me, but here we are. In my opinions, employers should never be looked to for the solutions to the inequities and hardship bestowed upon workers, especially low-wage and often black and brown workers, often black and brown women, who in the context of a global pandemic, I think many of whom were essential workers, learned just how essential they were to their employers, as some of their employers, could barely be relied upon to provide adequate PPE or paid sick days. Not to mention the government in this province, but that's a talk for another day, I think. Clearly, folks, things are very broken, and I believe the part to the answer of what ails us is, it starts with all of us, every single one of us. We can no longer be convinced, I think, that the ubiquity of violence, harm, and inequities foisted upon some communities is something that we should collectively accept. We deserve to do exactly what many of our ancestors hoped for us: to be able to rest, to dream, to play, to love, to be able to live a dignified life. I believe that's what our North Star should be. A pat on the back for introducing a handful of DEI initiatives should no longer be considered sufficient. We need to examine power, how it exists in society, our organizations and institutions, and of course in ourselves. I'm a leader in my organization, which means I have a responsibility to my colleagues, not just my colleagues, but also my community. And that responsibility is anchored in me using my power, the power that I have to help bring about the world where we're all set up to thrive. My commitment to community means that as a leader and as an employer, I've leveraged my power not just to talk about nice things, not to say, oh, things are so bad for certain groups. It's about moving resources. So I've used my power not just to hold the odd cultural potluck or set up a toothless under-resourced DEI or equity committee, but actually made change through looking at power and moving resources and eliminating barriers to accessing power within organizations, especially for sovereign people and folks from equity-deserving communities. Folks from communities that have had to navigate this strange and undignified, complex web of white supremacy and a bunch of other societal imposed barriers and state-sanctioned violence for far too long. During my time at FoodShare, committing to equity meant, again, moving resources and dismantling barriers. We introduced a policy that limited the income of the highest paid person to 3 times that of the lowest paid person. We grew our internal minimum wage. About 6 years ago when I started, it was $12 an hour. It's now $24 an hour. We also introduced a 7% cost of living increase across the board to help our colleagues with rising costs. And in the context of a global pandemic, not only did we provide more than enough PPE, we also introduced a $4 an hour pandemic pay top-up and kept it in place for 2 years. So that's $4 on top of a $24 an hour minimum wage for some of my colleagues who are working in our warehouse, packing produce, and the like. At Evenings and Weekends Consulting, the consulting firm I've started to help support other organizations wanting to rethink what's possible, we not only hire folks for a 4-day work week positions, but we also pay the people that we interview for jobs. We pay them $100 because we recognize that that's labor. And we can talk until we're blue in the face about equity and about all the wonderful things. But the reality is, if you're interviewing for a job, you will likely have to take time off work. You have to find childcare. It's time to put equity in action. It's time to put our dollars where our mouths are. We provide wellness days instead of sick days so that our colleagues we provide wellness days instead of sick days so that our colleagues don't have to wait until they get sick to prioritize their health. Again, the things that we've been convinced are normal, when you really think about them, are absolutely absurd. At organizations I've worked at, we've offered emergency non-interest loans of up to $2,000 for staff. We start health benefits on day 1. How absurd is it that employers force someone who may be dependent on critical medication to wait for 3 months until the employer will support them in accessing it? More absurdity. Can you imagine for a moment, dare to imagine a healthcare system that did more than provide sick care and that wasn't divorced from things like access to food, housing, community, and joy? None of this vision for how we live and how we care for one another should be dictated or depend on the benevolence of an employer. It's up to all of us. It's up to all of us to keep dreaming about the world that's possible. It's up to all of us to reject notions that the status quo or some incremental nonsense tinkering will help build the world that we need and deserve. Again, we all have a role to play in supporting the development of healthy communities and healthy people. So what I encourage you all to do is to keep dreaming, keep demanding better, so that one day our politicians and employers will have no choice because we accept nothing less. Thanks for listening. I hope that you've received my remarks this evening in a good way and with an open heart. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just so humbled to share the stage with everybody before me. And I feel like Paul's offered us all of the solutions already. I might bring us down a little bit. My name is Aziz. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer, and I'm based in Vancouver, which is the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I just want to start by acknowledging the tension in the work that I do in an immigration system that is founded in colonialism on this land, and what it means to welcome newcomers to colonized land. Some who are themselves fleeing the impacts of colonization in their own lands, and just what that means, the responsibility and I guess that tension that is alive for me in the work that I do. The work of the Migrant Workers Centre is focused on supporting migrant workers in Canada who have been or are being abused or exploited. And with tonight's theme of advancing work, it's impossible not to talk about the thousands of migrant workers upon which Canada and Canadians rely on, including in our agriculture, in our retail and hospitality, in construction, in healthcare, and of course in caring for our children and our elderly. Many Canadian employers rely heavily on migrant workers to fill predominantly low-wage jobs, often in sectors with poor working conditions, and just, as an example, crowded housing, hard physical labor. And the pandemic, I think, demonstrated that a lot of the essential workers that we depend on are migrant workers. It also showed us that a lot of these essential workers don't enjoy essential rights. The structure of Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program itself renders migrant workers prone to abuse and discrimination. And before I talk a little bit more about these conditions, I just want to recognize the many drivers of migration to Canada, including the global economic inequality between Canada and the global South, from which many migrant workers are coming, separating from their families in order to find a better life here in Canada or work, much like my parents did. And I note the paradox in considering Canada's foreign policy and our extractive industries that often contribute to this economic inequality and displacement of people from their homes. Canada has one of the highest rates of migration intensity in the world, and most recently this migration has shifted radically with an emphasis on temporary migration over permanence. Over the last 20 years, there has been a consistent shift away from permanent migration in favor of keeping migrant labor temporary in Canada. And this, I would argue, has had a profound impact on migrant workers' rights. Some workers who've been coming to Canada year after year for decades, working in our food supply chain with no pathway to permanence in this country, migrant workers have always been at a very significant power imbalance in relation to their employers. Unlike permanent residents and Canadian citizens, migrant workers are tied to their employers and cannot circulate freely in the labor market. Most migrant workers arrive in Canada with a work permit authorizing them to work for one employer, in one location, and in one type of occupation. And as a result, it leaves them very vulnerable and dependent on their employers for their jobs and their ability to remain in Canada. These conditions, of course, make it very difficult for migrant workers to access their rights and negotiate their working conditions, or to make a complaint against their employer, or to even leave an abusive employment situation. Without labor mobility, migrant workers are unable to access whatever labor rights they have on paper. It doesn't matter. From the beginning of the pandemic, migrant agricultural workers were more prone to contracting and dying of COVID-19, with more than 15 agricultural workers whose deaths have been confirmed since the start of the pandemic. Care workers saw their liberties reduced during the lockdowns, with employers barring workers from leaving the home of their employers under the guise of health and safety. And the threat of job loss and deportation from Canada makes migrant workers uniquely vulnerable to control and exploitation and less likely to come forward to report abuse. At the organization where I work, the Migrant Workers Centre, we often see workers in very precarious and dangerous situations with very difficult immigration circumstances. For example, Adriana, a worker from Guatemala who was recruited to work on a farm in British Columbia, made to work 16 hours a day without overtime pay, with few breaks, while being sworn at by her supervisors, physically assaulted, repeatedly called and referred to as an animal. Adriana had money stolen from her bank account by her employer, who fired her shortly after she became pregnant. Wallace, a farm worker from Jamaica who was injured on the job and threatened with repatriation back to his country because of his injury and need to recover before returning to work. A study the Migrant Workers Centre conducted earlier this year examined the cases of 30 migrant workers across mainly three different industries: home care, farm work, and restaurant workers, and found that actually over 96% of migrant workers face some form of financial abuse, including in the form of unpaid wages, excessive work time, being forced to repay a portion of their wages to their employer, or having paid a recruitment fee, despite legislation across the country making that illegal. 70% of the workers also experienced some kind of psychological abuse by their employer, including threats of deportation and racism. 30% of the workers reported having experienced physical abuse, and disturbingly 10% of the workers reported sexual abuse by their employer. We can and we must do better to protect all workers in Canada, including migrant workers and workers who don't have any documentation in Canada. As a country, we can and we should end work permits that tie migrant workers to an employer and ensure workers have access to permanent residence on arrival. Permanent residence, permanent status in this country is the one action that will reduce risk of exploitation and put migrant workers on a level playing field with other workers in Canada, lifting the floor of labor protections for everyone. Workers without status in Canada, refugee claimants who have come to Canada seeking protection, many of whom have put themselves at immense risk of COVID-19, of contracting COVID-19 on behalf of Canadians and others over the last 3 years, must be regularized and given permanent status in this country. And I would end just by saying that we have a moral obligation to these workers and other migrants in Canada, many of whom have worked for years in low-wage and dangerous jobs that are undesirable to Canadians, without an opportunity to ever become a permanent resident in this country. As a country with a long history of racialized and racist labor exploitation, we have an opportunity to do better and challenge the status quo, and to redefine who we welcome here and who we welcome to stay here permanently. To reimagine a fair and inclusive immigration system, one that recognizes the contributions of all migrants in this country, and one that upholds the rights and dignity of all migrants, including migrant workers. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good? Good. Okay. Well, I'm Samir Khan, and I'm a Senior Research and Evaluation Associate at the Future Skills Center, which is a center housed within Toronto Metropolitan University and funded by the federal government. And it's tasked with supporting dialogue, funding pilot programs, and research just about what we should be training for in the future of our economy as workers. So I've been asked to talk about advancing work as it relates to what is probably one of the big challenges I think we'd agree in this room. I hope we agree in this room. And that is, how do we address the changes that climate change is going to wreak on our societies and on our economies? And how do we avoid the worst impacts of it while hopefully mitigating some of what we think is going to be the worst case scenario? And that's a big topic, and I have to admit I was really nervous about doing this talk because unlike my esteemed colleagues here, I'm not on the front lines of environmental movement. I'm not a clean tech entrepreneur. I'm like a policy wonk who reads lots of reports and goes to webinars, talks to people. So what I have to share is, I think, some messages that I think hopefully you can take and use and think about when you think about climate change and you think about who you want to influence change around. Some messages to remind people and to hold people to account for what is really going on and what might be some of the implications we need to be thinking about for people who are going to live through this change. So the first point, and I feel like it's a safe space here. I feel like most people probably know this, but maybe you don't. But there are a bunch of viable scenarios now, like really viable scenarios in which Canada can get to net zero within a certain time frame, and that Canada's economy and that Canadian workers actually thrive. And that sounds like a good news story. I think for some people, maybe that's a little bit controversial. It can be hard to wrap your head around because it has been, I think, easy to say that decarbonization, because of the way we use energy, is just not incompatible with economic growth and incompatible with a flourishing of the workforce. But we now have several very complicated economic models done by some colleagues I'm looking around here in this room who have been responsible for some of them, that show that we can get there if we do certain things in a certain way, if we have the right mix of policies, if technology continues to advance. And it's not just looking forward in econometric models about our future. If we look at the last 15 years, there is a good news story buried between all the bad news stories about what we're beginning to see are the impacts of climate change. There's a really interesting study that showed in something like 30 countries, they've successfully been able to grow their economies while at the same time reducing emissions. And this is true for rich countries like the US and Japan. It's true for middle-income countries like Mexico. It's true for low-income countries like Jamaica and El Salvador. Canada, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, is not at this level, and that's really unfortunate. We can talk about why that's the case. But if we look at those countries that are successfully doing what we think is the right thing to do, there's some interesting things to observe. So one, the technology has advanced enormously in the last 15 years, and it's not just in the obvious things like wind and solar and batteries. Using gas for certain things as opposed to using coal reduces emissions, right? And that's an important point for us to be thinking about. And as technology begins to change, this should get better and better because no one could have foreseen how good things got 15 years ago from where they are now. Second, policies which have not been aggressive enough, where they've been implemented, have actually influenced change. So we have carbon taxes, which are not aggressive enough. We have regulations that have come on to bear that have not been aggressive enough. But they haven't damaged the economy, and quite the opposite. People have been able to grow their economies, as I mentioned, and decarbonize somewhat. And then the third point I want to make about why this might be the case, why our economy is growing, it's because all of this adoption of new technology, integrating it into the way our economy functions, requires workers. It requires people to build infrastructure. It requires people to learn new technologies. It requires people to do things like carbon audits and think about linkages between different problems that we need to be solving. And that all creates work, and that can't be done by a robot yet. That's a people job. And so for those reasons, I think that there's a lot of reasons to see that this is actually a viable possibility, and I think we should be mindful of that. Point number two, and this is where it begins to be in the if sort of range, we need to be thinking about whether we have people who know how to do what needs to be done. So I don't know if any of you have bought heat pumps recently and struggled to find a qualified technician, or let's say you got your hands on an electric car and you can't find somebody in a certain time frame to be able to install the high-speed charger. Those are just two obvious examples. If we think about all the things that need to transform in our economy, there are all people bottlenecks, people who need skills, who need the abilities to kind of think about how those things are going to change. And we aren't there yet, to be honest. And that is one of the things that's really important. That's one thing that we're really focused on at the Future Skills Center. The good news is that most of us have the ability, with a little bit of training, to be able to get there. No matter what we're doing, there is, I swear to you, probably some sort of decarbonization angle that you probably haven't thought of. And with a bit of training, whether you're a tradesperson, whether you're working in finance, You can get there, but that training takes time, it takes money, and that gets me to the last point I might want to make, which is we can't just jump ahead without addressing the needs of those who will be left behind. So if you think about somebody who's in the middle of their career and needs to transform what they do, we need to be thinking about what their obligations are to their family, to their household, where they live. And so if we're telling them they need to go and retrain, we need to provide them a pathway to make that viable for them to do. And that is something that we have not done historically in Canada, and something we need to really be thinking about. And this means more than just paying tuition. This means thinking about the cost of living. Like, where do you need to be to receive training, to take part in this new economy? If you're in a rural or remote community, working in forestry and oil and gas, where are you going to access that opportunity to retrain? We know that the impacts of the sustainable transition are going to be uneven. I think one of the things I've learned when I've been reading some of these reports is that Indigenous peoples actually make up a disproportionate number of people working in mining. Visible minorities are also a disproportionate number of people working in the oil and gas sector in Alberta. And so if we're telling everybody that they need to prepare for the future, we need to think also about those people who are living there right now and think about the systemic barriers that they already face. And as we ask people to come with us on the journey, we need to make sure that that future is inclusive of their needs as well. So in conclusion, I hope that some of the things I've been able to share convey a bit of an optimism about climate change, because it can very easily be something that feels very heavy-hearted and is impossible to solve. I assure you that there are a bunch of challenges, again, with the caveats around the if. And it's not a matter about being Pollyannish. I think this is a matter of thinking about the nuts and bolts of all the serious challenges we need to face and advocating from our leaders that they take those steps and lead us to that future. And so I thank you for inviting me to speak.
No pressure on going last, right? All right. So I'm here to talk about advancing work, but from the Black youth perspective. So my question to all of you is, have you been to Pearson lately? Any of you? Okay. I have to frequently go to Pearson Airport because I need to often go to the US. And so when you go into the line, there is the regular line, the one that I'm in, and it's extremely long, and it's like waving, like right when you think it's over, it's never actually over. And then there's the Nexus line. And the Nexus line, people just go on through. They're just hanging out. They have no worries in the world, while the rest of us are waiting in this very long line. And the thing about the Nexus line is, the people in the Nexus line, the more people that are there, the more troublesome it is for us, because they just like go up in front and go to the customs person, and it makes the line, the regular people line, a lot longer because they get to bypass. And you know what I do while I'm in the regular line? I look up how to put in a Nexus application every single time. I never finish it, but every time I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get in this Nexus line. And I reflect on the Nexus line versus the regular line, and I draw the analogy of the employment line. And as a young person myself, I unfortunately lost a parent at a very young age, and I found myself having to navigate just life, but also figuring out, like, is my life circumstance going to change where I saw myself in my career, the things that I wanted to do? Is this circumstance that has nothing to do with me and is just a circumstance, is it going to prohibit me as I see all of my peers and people who have two-parent households and the resources pass by in this Nexus line? If you haven't gotten it already, the Nexus line is the employment line, okay? And so I, over time, was able to find people who were able to explain to me how to get in the Nexus line, and took the time and the resources. And I heard talking about sponsorship, and the sponsorship that was required for me to be able to come out of the regular line and figure out how I wanted to get into the Nexus line on my terms and what that looked like for me. And that took time, but somebody invested the time in me to do that. So fast forward, here I am before all of you. I decided very early in my career that I wanted to dedicate my career to helping Black youth just like me figure out how to get out of the regular line and into the Nexus line. And so here I am. I'm the executive director at C Center for Young Black Professionals, which I always say is an honor and a privilege to be able to do. And what we talk about at C is we do workforce development, and recognizing that the unemployment rate for Black youth here in Ontario and Toronto is 28%. 28% of Black youth, where we make up 3% of the population, are unemployed. It's disgusting. So how can we get Black youth to come from the back of the unemployment line to the front? And it's twofold. Number one is at an individual level. So how we take three very distinct approaches. It's called relationship. Can everybody say relationship? We seem to forget this word when we're dealing with people, but what we do at C is build relationship with the young person. There's no blue pill that you can take that is going to solve all Black youth problems and take us from the back of this line to the Nexus line. But what it is going to require is for us to look at everyone individually. What is it that you need? What is your housing security? What's your food security? Is the job that you want to work conducive to your lifestyle and the type of life that you want to live? Are you going to be fulfilled in it? Understanding through relationship what their needs are and helping them build out an actual plan. The second approach is what we call a trauma-informed approach. Being in the back of the line sucks. And when you're told that you belong in the back of the line, that this is just your fate, and this is what happens, and people like you, this is where you stay. And imagine staying at the back of the line and watching everyone just keep going right in front of you and saying, you actually don't deserve to be in that line. These people deserve to go in front of you. The amount of work that it takes for us, I talk about the biggest challenge we have at C is to be able to undo the lie that's been told to our young people about them. And that requires us understanding the trauma that anti-Black racism has on young people. And the third approach that we take is a culturally relevant approach. How are we going to make sure that once they get into the Nexus line, we're letting them know what tools they need? What do you got to do? You got to take your laptop out, you got to take your phone out, you got to put it in a separate bin so that when they are ready and they get to the front of that line, they're able to move through security very swiftly. What does code switching mean? Why do you do it? What do you do when you show up to a workplace and it's not an inclusive workplace and you have a choice to either take out the tools in your pocket that have been provided to you and address the issue accordingly, or are you going to throw it out, say, forget this and I'm out of here? And so the individual level is the first fold. The second fold is external, and that's where all of us come in. Because when we talk about employment for Black youth, we look at strategic ways of doing this. We cannot handle Black youth employment like regular business. We can't treat it like the regular line. We also can't treat it like the Nexus line. We got to have a strategic approach. And so that, for us, means looking at labor gaps in the Canadian market where there is a gap. Like, nobody else knows how to do this. So if a Black youth gains those skills, nobody can deny them access because you need them, they need you. It's a perfect match made in heaven. And so we talk about strategic partnerships. And our strategic partnerships always look like this. 3 people need to be at the table for sure. There can be others that come along, so anyone who wants to join, feel free. But number 1, government needs to be at the table. Because government makes promises, and us as community organizations, we deliver. You don't see politicians going out and running food programs. You have Food Share doing that. And so government needs to be at the table. The second person that needs to be at the table is corporate Canada. You want diverse talent, you invest in the training. You come to the table, you build relationship, and that is how we are able to build a talent pool together. And thirdly, community. Of course, you cannot put a flag in the middle of a community and say, we're hiring, why isn't anyone showing up? When you have no relationship and no investment. And so that is the approach that we take. Strategic initiatives, strategic partnerships, and individual relationships. And
I think when we talk about advancing work, we also need to think about advancing people. So I believe that together, all of us in this room, take away what it is that we need to do. You can all find yourselves in any of the things that I discussed. And I think that the reality of the situation is that Nexus should be available to all Canadians, no?
I think some people are looking up Nexus on their phones right now. Thank you so much to Max Brault, Golnaz Golnaraghi, Alexandra McCann, Paul Taylor, Amanda Aziz, Samir Khan, and Agapi Gessesse. Paul, I just want to bring up what you said is if we're actually talking about advancing work, it's about advancing life and finding joy. So thank you all. A big round of applause for our incredible speakers this evening. So this is where I invite our speakers to make their way to the reception. The rest of you stay put. While they do that, I'm going to give them some time just to grab a drink and get organized. I'll tell the rest of you a little bit more about what we have coming up at the Walrus. If you enjoyed tonight's talks, we have one coming up on January 17th. We'll be launching our 20th year with the Walrus Talks at Home Inequality, presented by Oxfam. We have a table in the back, and we encourage you to stop by to stay in touch with us. Sign up for our newsletter. We'll also send you a follow-up email where you can opt in. For those of you with us in person, we have a special subscription deal for you tonight. 8 issues of The Walrus delivered to your door for just $25. This is also a great gift. So if you want to do some holiday shopping, you can get it done tonight. Just visit the Walrus table. The team will sign you up. As many of you know, today is also Giving Tuesday, or as some of us in the media like to say, Giving News Day, because we can't resist a pun, and because those of us in the media who are also registered charities, it's an opportunity to give back. The history of Giving Tuesday is it's become year after year a bigger movement where you can take an opportunity to identify a charity or cause that's important to you and ensure that they receive funding by the end of the year. We do what we do thanks to our community of support. So on this day of giving, consider making a donation. You can make it at our table. All gifts of $20 or more will receive a charitable tax receipt. Thanks again to everyone at TD Bank Group for making this important conversation possible. Thank you to our annual sponsors, Air Canada, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, and Shaw. And thanks everyone for coming out in person and online and being a part of the Walrus community. Have a great evening.